giving the Syrian rebels heavy artillery and possibly anti-aircraft guns. Hopefully, according to them, that will help to sow the seeds of a peaceful democracy.
Well, I think if you look at what the Muslim Brotherhood has been reported doing since they took the presidency in Egypt, you'll see that the Syrian opposition is dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, the same organization, and their long-term agenda is introducing an Al-Qaeda or Taliban-like fanatical Islamic Sharia law into Syria and ending the tolerance of different religions, which has been the trademark of Syrian life for decades under the al-Assad family, but in general. And there are reports from journalists inside Syria over the last months of the so-called opposition. In many cases, they're Al-Qaeda or Mujahideen that have been brought in from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere and provided guns and weapons, that they have beheaded civilians and blamed the atrocities on the Assad government. So this is really, I don't know what you could call the equivalent of the Fabius recognition of a government in exile or building a government in exile. Perhaps if the Russian government were to recognize the Ku Klux Klan as a government in exile in America and provided heavy artillery so that they could go against Washington.
I got an email from someone in Syria, and I said I wouldn't read her name. I'm living in Syria. My city is Aleppo. We have lots of problems here. All these terrorists are coming from other countries and killing here the people. And almost all media out there not telling the truth. They're telling that our government are killing innocent people. This is not true. We are Christians living here, but we are now in danger. Syria isn't like Yemen or Libya. There are huge numbers of Christians here, but U.S. and some Europe governments don't caring about Christians here, just sending money and weapons to those people.
Demonstrating alliance solidarity, the Dutch, German and Turkish defense ministers have paid a visit to NATO Patriot batteries in Turkey. At an airbase in the southern city of Adana, the Dutch defense minister thanked her troops for their efforts. She said the Netherlands is proud to contribute to the protection of the Turkish people and their territory.
It's important for the Netherlands to be part of this mission because an ally and a country that we have close relationships with already for decades asked for assistance. So we acted accordingly to the Netherlands. The NATO solidarity does matter. And when we received the request, we said yes, and Parliament supported it. And the same goes for Germany and the United States.
The Syrian government maintains it's fighting terrorists, armed and controlled from abroad. Well, for more on what's happening in and around the war-torn country, I'm now joined live by political analyst Sukant Chandan. Sukant, NATO says that these missiles will act as a deterrent and they will de-escalate the conflict. So presumably a welcome move, this deployment of these missiles.
When has NATO ever been interested in the human rights of the people of the global south? Never. They've only been interested in domination and trauma, as we can see most profoundly and illustratively in relation to what they've done in Libya. So this is not in any way going to help the Turkish and especially the Syrian people. It's another step towards the final nail in the coffin, which the NATO hopes is the regime change against Syria. Now, we just had the conflict in Gaza, and I've been saying for a good part of 2 years that the resistance in Gaza has realized that it wants to have an open battle of war of liberation with the Zionist state and their Western backers to refocus this whole essentially pro-NATO in its policies Arab Spring, or should I call it the NATO Arab Sting in the region. And with the resistance in Gaza that we saw just a few days ago, that's exactly what happened. Everything was starting to be exposed. Morsi was exposed as nothing better than Mubarak, and also it showed that the real enemy of the Arabs is the Zionist state and their backers, and that the Syria, Hezbollah and Iran were fundamental to the victory of the resistance in Gaza. And just like all the Arab armies were arrayed against Saddam back in the beginning of the 90s, similarly now Ba'athist Syria can turn the whole situation around if it does only what Saddam Hussein did at that time, which was to launch a war of liberation against the Zionist state itself. The Scuds flew at Tel Aviv back in the early 90s. 90s. We saw the Fajr 5s from Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria flying at Jerusalem and Tel Aviv last week. And it's this, if Syria can focus on this struggle, the Arab masses, the Muslim masses, and the masses of the global south will rally to its cause. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a slow slide towards regime change in Syria, which is just an awful tragedy.
You talked about the launch of Scud missiles. Are you actually saying that these Patriot missiles will be used and actually be fired into Syria?
Well, they're deployed there. Well, what else is military hardware used, if not for either for military pressure?
Turkey's saying that they're using them. Obviously, they're saying they will need them to defend their citizens because some Turks have been killed already. Is Syria deliberately targeting Turkey?
No, of course Syria is not. Syria has no interest, and actually Turkey has no interest to ratchet up things against Syria either, because Turkey, after Syria, which I've said before, is the #1 loser in this whole situation in Syria, because they're negatively impacted by the refugees. Erdogan is becoming less and less popular inside Turkey because of his Syria policies. So this is not at all in the interest of Syria and Turkey. This is NATO taking Turkey along into this disastrous mess. But NATO are clever, or they're clever because our side is stupid, because on the one hand they're using Turkey against Syria, but also they're weakening Turkey in relation to Syria as well, because the West are very clever. They know that although Turkey is an ally today, tomorrow it could be a regional power against the West, which it was before this whole Syria debacle, when Turkey had excellent relations with Syria, Iraq, Iran.
Sorry, you say the West is very clever, but has it really worked out what it'll do once Assad goes?
As Samar Amin, who's one of the best analysts of anti-imperialism in the global south from Egypt, has said, the West is only interested in destroying all Arab societies in order to create trauma, deep trauma within those societies, so it can facilitate the war and regime change operation against Iran successfully. This and only this is what the West is interested in right now in the Middle East, North African region.
Just a quick word about the threat of chemical weapons. That's been cited as another reason to deploy these Patriot missiles. Is that really a serious threat? Isn't the worry that, well, if there is a power vacuum, what happens to these alleged chemical weapons? That's the worry, isn't it?
Now, I'm glad you raised the issue about chemical weapons, because there's a few points to be made. One, this is an obvious war propaganda trick by the NATO powers to justify in the minds of the public that a bombing campaign should be conducted by NATO, at least a no-fly zone, against the Ba'athist Syrian government. Okay. But the second point is that I've been to Vietnam, to the orphanages and to the government support centers of those children affected by Agent Orange because of the US bombing of Vietnam. We know that what depleted uranium has done to Iraq in terms of the newborns' deformities, and Winston Churchill was the first leader of any power to use chemical weapons against who? Against what he called the savage tribes in Iraq in the early 1920s. So really putting some historical context to it.
Depleted uranium, also known as Q-metal, D38, and DU, is a toxic and radioactive byproduct created in the production of enriched uranium for nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. It has a radioactive half-life of 4.4 billion years. The US and NATO militaries began using bullets made of depleted uranium in 1991 in the Persian Gulf War, and they have continued using it in every major armed conflict since that time. DU is used because it is extremely dense, 1.6 times as dense as lead, which makes it ideal for piercing heavy armor. Just to give you an idea of how much this is being used, the US fired 640,000 pounds of DU ammunition in the first Gulf War alone. In the initial 2003 invasion, they used an estimated 4 million pounds. When a depleted uranium shell hits its target, it explodes on impact, burning at extremely high temperatures, vaporizing into an ultra-fine aerosol with a large percentage of the particles as small as 1/10 of a micron in size. To put that in perspective, these are literally as small as viruses. This depleted uranium dust spreads out into the atmosphere, where it finds its way into water and food supplies, and is inhaled by both soldiers and civilians living and moving throughout the area. Studies have shown that upon inhalation, these particles are small enough to pass through the nose, through the olfactory nerves, and into the brain, where it accumulates. Depleted uranium also accumulates in the bones and teeth due to the fact that the body replaces calcium with it. Governments that use DU always like to portray it as safe by referring to how solid chunks don't emit enough radiation to be harmful from a distance. But this defense fails to account for the fact that these microscopic radioactive particles, once absorbed into tissues, are in direct contact with cells throughout the body. And once it's in the body, there is no way to remove it, nor can these microscopic particles be removed from the environment at large. And remember, depleted uranium remains radioactive for over 4.4 billion years. One of the hidden tragedies of the Iraq wars has been the marked increase in birth defects, nervous system anomalies, and cancer rates. In some areas, birth defect rates have been shown to have increased by 15 times what they were before the war. It's also worth noting that after the Gulf War, thousands of soldiers became chronically ill and have never recovered. This condition is officially called Gulf War syndrome. The U.S. government denies that this illness has any connection with the EU, even though soldiers far from the front lines have been found to have large quantities of these radioactive particles in their system. Now, given these facts, you would think that countries that claim to care about human rights would condemn the use of depleted uranium weaponry. However, there have been multiple attempts to impose a moratorium on its use over the years, but France, Britain, the US, and Israel have consistently blocked such proposals. The next time you hear one of these governments or the mainstream media of one of these countries talking about chemical or nuclear weapons that some country may have or be planning to build, keep that in mind.
The planned multi-billion-dollar U.S. missile defense shield in Europe might not be able to protect America from possible Iranian airstrikes. The flaws were highlighted in classified studies made by the Defense Department, prepared for a congressional briefing. For more on this, we are now joined live by Bruce Gagnon, a coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. Bruce, thank you very much for being with us. Now, first, let's get right to this. If the complex is flawed, why is it still on the cards to be built in the first place?
Well, first off, and most importantly, I don't think it was ever intended to protect against Iranian missiles, something, in fact, that do not even exist today. Iran has no nuclear weapons, nor do they have the capability to launch a missile all the way to the United States. So I think the so-called missile defense system, which in fact is a key part of U.S. first strike strategy, it's the shield to be used after the sword has lunged into the heart of Russian and Chinese nuclear forces. And clearly this missile defense system has always been about surrounding Russia and China. And that's why the math doesn't work when you look at having it protect against an Iranian system.
Now, one of the flaws that has been mentioned is the actual location of the system in Romania and Poland, something that we all know that Russia has been voicing their concerns about. Can we expect any changes on the location issue?
I don't think so. In fact, as NATO is expanding in its encirclement of Russia, I think we're only going to see more of these so-called, again, missile defense deployments into various NATO countries. So I think the ones in Poland and Romania, and now there's a radar going into Turkey, these are going to stay, but I think attempts are going to be made to put these systems into places like Georgia and other countries very close to the Russian borders, which in fact is only going to increase tensions between the United States and Russia, as is happening in China today, as the U.S. is encircling China with these same missile defense systems. The Aegis destroyers, the Navy destroyers that are outfitted with these missile defense interceptors, are going to be put into the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, Mediterranean Sea, really increasing the encirclement of Russia in the years ahead. And in fact, as the new generations of these interceptor missiles are built, they're going to become even more technologically sound, sophisticated, much faster, and that will only make the problem worse.
Well, given that the billions of dollars have already been spent on the system in its current state, it's now showing serious flaws. Does it make sense to spend any more money on this? Will the U.S. invest more?
I think it's a bad expenditure, of course, as our economy is collapsing here at home in the United States. We're wasting enormous amounts of money on the military-industrial complex. So clearly I'm opposed to these systems. But looking at how this oligarchy runs our country today, how the corporations control our Congress, I think it's clear that Congress will continue to support these systems. The new Secretary of Defense that Obama has nominated, Chuck Hagel, former Republican senator from Nebraska, was one of the co-sponsors in the Senate of the missile defense program. So he clearly is a strong ally of this system. And